Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics Football. It's Fran here, and I'll be back with the cheat sheet this week. And just a little kind of change from the previous videos is that I'll be kind of zooming into different sections of the cheat sheet as we go along, just so it's easier for any kind of mobile users to actually watch the video. So if you're wondering why it looks slightly different in terms of the format, that's how it is. So let's actually go into the defenders. So with the defenders, we'll actually start with that kind of 4.0, 4.1 bracket. I don't think really much has changed, to be quite honest. We all know, I think Livramento and Duffy were the most sensible options in those kind of price ranges, given the fact that you have access to a Brighton defense at a very cheap price of 4.2. And, Livramento, same thing, where it seems like Southampton's defense is actually surging. Plus, with the kind of possibility of him actually moving into right wing this season, I mean, you could literally have, an out of position player who could get you clean sheets and even more attacking dividends. So for me, of course, Livermore is the clear cut best option, with Duffy kind of being a close second. He got an assist this weekend, but I think if you actually go in and watch that assist, you'll kind of realize that it was a bit of a questionable one. But ultimately, he earned that assist, and if you're a Duffy owner, I suppose you just move. In terms of the 4.4 to 4.6 players, I think the only kind of real movement this week is once again just recognizing the fact that the kind of underlying numbers for Spurs are matching up in terms of when they're actually facing solid opposition. I still think this defense can actually hold on to clean sheets, versus weaker opposition. We saw some fantastic saves from Lloris. To be honest, the Conte goal was a little bit suspect. Also conceding from a set piece, from Thiago Silva and also Rudiger, to be honest, those were both set pieces, isn't something you expect to do every week. But I think Chelsea created just enough attacks to say, Spurs were clearly not an astute defense today. I think there were multiple opportunities, for example, for Lukaku to actually set people up, right? And due to that, I think it makes sense to actually downgrade the Spurs defense. I would say when you're looking actually at the best defenses now, it's a mix of Brighton, it's a mix of Brentford, and it's a mix of Wolves. Wolves obviously had a terrible performance, and Brentford, to be honest, is one of those teams that haven't had a terrible performance yet. But I would also argue that they haven't been facing some better teams, just yet. And that's how I kind of rate things. In terms of the 4.9 to the kind of 5.1 range of players, I think once again there's not much change. I brought Cash in. I think Cash is the most interesting because I think he's less kind of rotation prone compared to someone like Target. And on top of that, I think when he actually goes into attack, I think he's the one who's more likely going to kind of maybe score or actually, create chances due to actually running off to the end of the ball. So, for example, when people were kind of rating Semedo because he was, kind of making these deep lying runs and taking these one-on-ones versus the keeper, I think Cash is someone who's more like that, whereas Target is more often just looking for crosses and things like that to kind of get himself into the game and contribute. So I think Cash has a little bit more explosive potential there. And on top of that, you just have access to that Villa defense. And despite the fact that the Villa fixtures are somewhat rough, I think, if you're interested in maybe like moving away from someone like Soufal or moving away from someone like Reguilon, I think Cash is quite interesting. If you don't have access to, let's say, or you don't want to go into someone like Christensen, who might be a bit rotation prone, or you don't want to go into Matip because you already have Trent. So that's pretty much how I feel about that. In terms of Semedo and Reguilon, it's just the case where I think, with Semedo, as I said, you don't want to spend more than 4.5 million on a Wolves defender, right? You want to spend that 4.5 million, whether it's Cody or if you had Marcel previously, those make sense to me. Semedo was just kind of, I think, just basically an outlay of cash that I don't think you need to do, especially when it's so much better to actually move more money into defense and get someone like Diaz and someone like Cancelo, who we'll discuss shortly. In terms of Rudiger and Alonso, I think, we've reached a point where we've watched enough Chelsea games to say that I think Alonso is starting to be, pretty much close to being nailed. And obviously Chilwell is waiting on the wings and Chilwell has been on the bench, but I think clearly Tuchel, prioritizes having Alonso in the field, and the true nailed player is Rudiger in that system, right? Rudiger has been playing both in the Champions League and in both easier and kind of tougher matches in the Premier League. And I think on that basis, you can say Rudiger makes a lot of sense. I don't think Rudiger is a huge aerial threat. It seems like Thiago Silva is probably the most kind of interesting aerial threat for now. But Rudiger also makes plenty of runs forward sometimes. He's been making two magical runs, I think, both in the Zenit game and also in the Spurs game, where he probably could have laid on the ball to someone else, but he's always looking to get into dangerous territory, and still he's pretty much a fox in the box sometimes when it comes to the set pieces, as we saw with the goal versus Tottenham. Now, I don't think you're expecting that on a week-to-week basis, but it's the fact that you have that kind of Chelsea defender who could get bonus points just like Diaz did this week. for Man City. So I think when we're moving forwards, it's good to consider at least one or two Chelsea defenders alongside probably a City defender as we move on week on week. Reece James for me stays in that kind of range where he's a good player, but and a good asset. But I think the reason why he's not a best asset is because I just think there actually is potentially more kind of contesting of that position. We saw Reece James play versus Man City last season, and I actually expect that he might be able to play there because it seems like I think Tuchel kind of likes the matchup of James into Sterling or someone like that, but we have to kind of wait and see as well, how he plans to address someone like Grealish, whether it's kind of putting Reece James up against him or Azpilicueta. Now, of course, James also gets to take some corners and set pieces. And at times, when he's playing, of course, we can see him contribute a lot in terms of open play. But I think there's a risk as well, with rotation that Hudson-Odoi can play in the easier games. And sometimes, as we saw today with Tottenham, there is an opportunity, for example, for Azpilicueta to be kind of moved on to that right wing back position, and someone like Christensen being pushed out into right centre back. And as a result, I think both Reece James and Alonso are kind of in that territory where they're kind of rotation prone. I'd probably actually make a decision and say, I would rather go for Rudiger first, and then maybe pick one of the other two if you don't already have a Chelsea defender. I personally, of course, as you know, have Christensen, and for that reason, I think I won't be dipping into someone like Alonso or Reece James. I'd rather have a second, player for Chelsea who's nailed, and that would probably be Rudiger in that system, right? That's pretty much how I feel about that. I think you can make a decision between Alonso and Reece James, and I think Rudiger should really be the kind of first priority target for Chelsea. But that's just my opinion because I like to play things slightly a bit safer. Walker, I think, of course, there's going to be rotation in City. Of course, Cancelo can play right back and Zinchenko can play left back. But I think ultimately, if you want to save a little bit of money and you don't want to spend that kind of 6.0 into Diaz or Cancelo, which I would actually advise to do, Walker is available at 5.5. And I think he, of course, plays much more games than Zinchenko does because of the fact that Cancelo can play left back. And that's pretty much how I see things. So I think Walker makes sense if you want to take like a kind of budget cut and get into the Man City defense. But I think it's going to be similar to last season where, unfortunately, I think Walker isn't someone who's very good at getting bonus points just due to the way he plays. I think Cancelo is so much more active in terms of attack. And then in terms of, Diaz and another central defender, you probably have the opportunity to get more clean sheets due to the fact that they're kind of making more recoveries and things like that, so on, that will actually add to bonus points. So I think Walker's at that kind of weird range where you probably don't want to go for him. You probably want to spend that extra money to get that better City defender. With Cresswell, I think it's just the fact that I think even Azuma makes the kind of West Ham defense look just a bit better. I think it's the fact that a lot of these defenders are going to be pushed down, in my opinion, just due to the fact that at that 5.5 or even 6 price range, I think there's so much more of an upgrade from these Chelsea Man City players. When we look at last season, the fact that Man City had 19 clean sheets, I don't think it's crazy to say that Liverpool, Man City, and Chelsea can all have that kind of level of clean sheets. And those points, even though that might mean less bonus points on an individual basis, could transform your season, I think. And when you have to compare to teams that are much weaker defensively, such as West Ham, such as United, such as Leicester, or even Everton, it just doesn't really make sense to kind of spend 5.5 on a West Ham defender right now, on a Man United defender or a Leicester defender. So I think Shaw clearly is also someone who pretty much is disadvantaged by this. I think we've seen a lot of mistakes from United in terms of their ability to kind of contain the ball outside the box, around that kind of midfield space. And it's not really due to the fact that their back four is a bad back four. That's not the case. It's just the fact that I think at times they allow for the opponents to build very, very strong attacks without actually stopping them in the midfield. And the lack of midfield control is what kind of leads them to, conceding goals. Of course, you can say the Benrahma goal was a bit unlucky today, and that's totally fine. But we've also seen, some very fluky goals being scored versus United. But we've also seen kind of like huge attacks being created versus other teams that I wouldn't say you would have expected when you're watching Chelsea or Liverpool or City. So I think there's just that kind of disparity right now where even though Shaw is such an interesting chance creator, we have to probably fall back and say it's not worth it to continue having Shaw, especially as the fixtures get just a little bit tougher. With Pereira, I think it's much the same. I think Pereira and Dean are both in the camp where I think Pereira is more interesting as an attacking option, to be honest, this season, just watching him play. Dean is much less interesting due to the fact that I think he doesn't get into attack much often, and he's a very, very poor defender. I mean, he was at fault for, I would say, both the goals that Everton conceded on the left flank. He caused an own goal himself and also kind of let Matty Cash pretty much dribble through him. And that's not a good sign if you're kind of interested in the Everton defense, because I think the only kind of reason why we would have dipped into the Everton defense was for the clean sheets. Just because, as I mentioned in the previous few episodes, Dean wasn't attacking enough. And that's pretty much how I feel with that camp. And as you can understand, the same pretty much falls in terms of the Man United defenders. Not much difference at all in terms of Trent, Diaz, Cancelo, and Robertson. I think Robertson, the reason why you have to avoid him is now that there's clearly a better option in terms of rotation now for Liverpool. Now that Klopp has some faith in Tsimikas and what he can provide, and that's why we saw Robertson get rotated fairly. Trent, I think, is someone who obviously missed the game due to illness, but it's clear that I think there is a much more significant downgrade in terms of attacking potential with Milner. I think Milner provides so much in terms of defense that obviously Klopp has the faith for Milner to cover pretty much any position in the pitch, as we've seen in the past. But I don't think we'll see Klopp do it all the time, in the sense that he's doing it to rotate Trent. As he mentioned in the press conference, he said that Trent was set to play. So you can clearly see whilst Robertson was due for rotation, probably due to the fact that he's coming off of injury, Trent is someone who's actually given the license to play pretty much all the games as long as he can. And that's pretty much how I feel about the defense. So let's actually move on to the midfield. In terms of the midfield, so we actually are looking at, at the 4.5 to 4.6 price range, not any changes in terms of Bissouma, Gilmore, Sissoko, Allan. There's obviously more players as well, players playing in Norwich, other kind of clubs. It's just not really an interesting kind of thing to talk about. I don't think there's some sort of player who we're missing out who's going to be fantastic. I think things are pretty much as they are. These are players who aren't going to be really getting anything onto, FPL points other than the occasional assist, right? And for that reason, I just think it's not that interesting of a discussion. In terms of 5.5, I think there really hasn't been too much movement there. I would still kind of rate Gallagher quite the same. I think versus a much tougher team, I think Crystal Palace isn't going to effectively build attacks. I think they try to, but definitely versus more solid defenses, they're just going to struggle to actually build those points. We saw that in the Liverpool game and the Chelsea game. But when it comes to them kind of fighting these kind of mid-table teams, as we saw, for example, with West Ham, I think there's clearly potential for him to actually get good hauls, given the fact that he's on set pieces. And he always makes these darting runs. If you actually ever watch him play as a football player, he always makes these runs forwards. So I think he's very interesting in terms of that. And Belmo was someone who I think was missing, basically. He was bound to pretty much score eventually, right? Due to the amount of chances he's created, due to the fact that he's hit the post one or two times. And for that reason, I think Mbeumo, justifiably gets his rise. I think, part of it too is a team building confidence, and Brentford were able to kind of, I think, dispatch Wolves quite, strongly last week. And on that basis, I think you can say Mbeumo is an interesting differential, but I think nothing more right now, because I still think the talisman is probably going to be Tony. But as we saw in previous weeks, there's also chances where, Tony can blank and Mbeumo can blank, because I think Brentford are probably more interested, I think, in keeping that defensive structure as opposed to sacrificing it to kind of create attacks. And that's why I think they're just differentials right now. With Odegaard, I mean, it was nice to see him score a set piece. Obviously, that's good news for Arsenal, because I think, when you look back at, for example, Xhaka, who was probably someone who was on their free kicks previously, you probably weren't expecting him to score that often. I would say Odegaard is probably also better at crossing it into the box, potentially getting assists from free kicks on that basis, getting some corners off as well. But he's not that interesting to me as an FPL asset. I think, yes, he's at a price where he's an enabler, and he's kind of interesting on that basis. But I think other than that, he's just a light differential. I think there's still much more interesting options in terms of Gray, given the fact that DCL is out, and Gallagher, in my opinion. And that's how I see things right now. In terms of the 5.9 to the 6.4 players, I think there's been, a little bit of movement on this front. I think Benrahma actually really impressed me in the United game, not because he scored that kind of deflected goal, but just the fact that, with the press, he works very well with the system. And when he actually gets to play in that 10 spot, he does create things. And he probably was due for an assist today, if Bowen actually had his shooting boots. And ironically, that's exactly why you can see Bowen taking a kind of fall, And I think Bowen, was kind of tasked today with being the striker, but I think, over the course of the season, I'm not sure exactly what it is. It could just be a lack of confidence. He's struggled to find the net, to be honest. He's created chances for his team, but ultimately, as an FPL asset, you have to say he just doesn't look clinical enough. Whereas Benrahma is someone who is. I'm not saying, he of course mastered the kind of laws of trigonometry and found that goal for his United, but I do think, in easier games such as the Leeds game next, he becomes a very interesting asset. And to be honest, I think he's found or justified, kind of staying in my team for the next few weeks. So I think that's pretty much how I feel about Benrahma. I think he still makes a lot of sense on that kind of price that he's on. In terms of Sarr, I think you just have to look at the fact that Watford were able to kind of decimate a very weak team in Norwich. When you actually look at the week previous, I think Arsenal, also created some serious XG versus Norwich, but weren't able to kind of really score. I do think Sarr is quite a direct player, and he's always someone who looks to kind of fight for these rebounds, take shots whenever he can, and that will be key versus Newcastle and Leeds, who are very, very easy fixtures. I think if you're an attacking player looking to kind of create things. When you look at, for example, the Rafinha goal, ultimately that was actually I think work created, to be honest, by Rodrigo and his kind of ingenuity in terms of being able to kind of see that situation would deceive the keeper. And Rafinha, to be honest, had a much better chance himself to one-on-one the keeper. And I think those are kind of chances where, because the way that Newcastle are kind of starting to commit a few more bodies forward when they kind of hit the counter with some of their fullbacks kind of pushing forwards at times. I do think that you can see that in the narrow structure, the wingers actually for the opposing teams are actually given a lot of space, and I kind of see those kind of pockets that Rafinha unlocked last week. Sarr kind of exploiting them as well. So I think Sarr is super interesting on that basis, and I think he's definitely one to look at. Not just because we're chasing points, but just due to the fact that he has very nice fixtures. With Fornals and Saka, I have to say that, Saka drew an assist this week, but I just don't think he's that interesting as an FPL asset. He's someone who always tries to dribble forwards, carry the ball for Arsenal. He isn't given a role where he's allowed to be as direct, as he is for England, for example, because, Arsenal have a much harder time actually moving the ball forwards into the opponent and their half. Whereas with Fornals as well, it's more of a fact that I think I still prefer Benrahma over Fornals slightly. I know he's slightly cheaper, but ultimately I think if you want to go for a West Ham player, you're probably going for at most two West Ham players, and I would prefer Benrahma in that space compared to Fornals, and that's pretty much how I see things. I think it's similar to the Soucek situation where I've taken Soucek out of my list because of the fact that I think, yes, maybe he's due for, a header or two within the season, but is he going to be as talismanic as someone like Benrahma? I don't think so. And that's pretty much how I see things. In terms of Traore, Trincao, they stay the same. I think there's new assets in terms of Trossard and Bailey, but I won't touch on them much because Bailey seems to be, potentially injured. I'm not exactly sure what the exact situation is with him. So unfortunate, of course, that after such a great kind of game as a substitute, which once again he produced really well in, because if you actually look at, for example, the Watford game at the start of the season, he was someone who actually changed that game, ultimately turned it into a 3-2 game and a much closer game than it actually looked on paper, because that game was pretty much dead in the water. So I think Bailey has been a huge impact sub, and I think if he actually finds fitness and gets to start games, I think he can be a very kind of illustrious piece for Aston Villa. But right now, of course, you'd probably avoid him. With Trossard, I think he's basically someone who will benefit when Brighton actually find their shooting boots. But I think Brighton just aren't creating enough chances themselves. When you actually look at the XG, they're finally overperforming their XG, and that's a credit to Brighton. I'm happy they're able to actually overperform that. But they are really overperforming this season. It's completely different to last season where they were clearly underperforming. And I think at one point the underlying stats pretty much match a team at that level. Given the fact that it's not like they have talismanic players that are world class, right? We have to be fair with the squad and say that I think Trossard is kind of at the right price, but I think he's not like a significant explosive differential. He could be someone who each week could be getting assist or a goal at best, I would say, and I think for that reason he really remains as a differential. In terms of the kind of 6.9 to the 7.7 players, I think I have to kind of drop all the kind of talismanic players that we think, or kind of second talismans, I'd argue. So, for example, Greenwood is clearly like a second or third talisman for United. Jota one, probably behind Salah and Mane. Torres, someone who's probably still behind KDB when he's fit. And also, to be honest, when you look at impact, I think Grealish as well is someone who's much more nailed than Torres. And then on top of that, you look at that kind of UCL game where, City scored a multitude of goals and Torres wasn't really a part of any of them. Not because he's not working hard, not because he's not a good player, but just when you actually pick a Man City player, you have to kind of know you're playing with the roulette in the sense that even if someone's on the field, they might not contribute. So that's why I think it's so much more interesting getting a Man City player who's actually a defender, because even if they don't contribute in the game, they're more than likely going to get a clean sheet, right? So I think we're approaching that territory where I think right now it's better to actually rate the midfielders slightly lower because it seems like the defenders are much more valued this season. And that's my honest opinion. I think I'll be moving more into defenders than midfielders and playing around with them in the near future. So I'll probably be more interested in the enablers, and that's why we don't really have like a clear best option between Greenwood, Jota, and Torres. I think they've all fallen. In terms of Mount, I think the issue with him is that we've seen that he's rotatable, right? We've seen that he was dropped so that he could play in the UCL game. And then in the game versus Tottenham, he was actually subbed off in 45 minutes so that Conte could play. And we saw, I think, Chelsea play tremendously better without Mount. And that's not a slight on Mount. I think there are some games tactically where Mount makes a lot of sense. Look at the way he kind of decimated Real Madrid, to be honest, in the previous season alongside some of his teammates. So I think, when you look at Mount, it's just a case that at 7.5, is it worth it if he's not kind of a set and forget option for Chelsea, even if the fixtures are nice? I don't think he's an explosive pick per se. He's someone who could get 1 goal or 1 assist per game, just like how I kind of explained, Trossard works as an FPL asset. But I think on that basis, given the fact that he's rotation prone as well, he's not worth it. I think he's a differential. Gundogan, I think, is someone who probably does deserve a goal. He is someone like Grealish who's extremely nailed right now in the Man City system and can play even when KDB comes in or even when Foden comes in. I think on that basis, due to the amount of chances he's created, he's probably imminent for a goal if you kind of subscribe to that kind of logic. But ultimately, does it really make sense to actually put your eggs in the Gundogan basket when he's actually much more well priced this season? Probably not. With Pepe, I would kind of make the argument that just similar to Saka, where not because he's someone who's licensed with ball carrying. I think Tomiyasu has to still kind of combine and kind of work on that relationship with Pepe, but I just don't think Arsenal are creating enough chances. You look at that Burnley game, and I think they were pretty lucky to, I would say, win that game. To be honest, I think that game should have been a draw. To be honest, I think that would have been fair for both teams. I think the defense put on a very kind of astute performance, but it seems like this Arsenal team is clearly a step below some of the other teams in the league. And I think at 7.5, you're probably only wanting to look at these kind of key players for these teams that can actually be explosive in terms of how many goals they can score in the season. And I don't think Arsenal is one of those teams. That's pretty much how I see things. I have kind of risen Son just due to the fact that it seems like he's no longer injured. I'm not exactly sure what the exact situation is with him completely, but he did look quite direct and kind of offensive, I think, versus Chelsea in the first half. And we all knew Chelsea was going to be a tough game, and we all know Son actually performs versus Arsenal. So I think obviously this is the time to kind of rise him. He's a clear differential for now, I think, given the fact that he's quite pricey, and there's, I think, just much more security with the other premiums in other teams. So I think that's just how I see things right now. And Mane, I've just added as a differential just simply due to the fact that I think, Mane has been one of the players who has been creating the most kind of shots in the league alongside Ronaldo. On kind of shots per game basis, and I think he's still getting a lot of chances in the Liverpool system. Liverpool are finally playing and dominating games, to be quite honest, and when they are dominating games, I think Mane, of course, becomes a very interesting asset. But I would keep him as a differential for now because we know why Salah is more interesting as an asset. I think Salah brings a little bit more in terms of the table, in terms of creating kind of consistent creative chances through assists, and then of course the penalties really have to make a difference. And I'd say due to the fact that as well Jota is still, I think, well priced, and the Firmino situation is probably going to kind of slightly shift after this week. It might be the case that we actually move away from Jota if we think Firmino will start, but I still think Mane is a differential just because he's so insanely priced, I would say. And that's pretty much how I see things. You could always pivot away from Mane into someone like Kevin De Bruyne. They're both at that kind of 11.9 price, but at this point in time, it just makes more sense to have your money in terms of the premium forwards, especially when Lukaku is still 11.5 or 11.6. And let's move on to the forwards. In terms of the forwards, I would say I have to give Dennis a rise just due to the fact that, as I said, Watford have very nice fixtures. So if you're actually looking to kind of maybe change the scope of your team, change the formation of your team, maybe Dennis makes sense kind of during this fixture where you actually get a lot of value from him in the next 2 games. Other than that, I think he plays left wing at times. So I think some people are kind of deceived by the fact that he played striker versus Watford. I think Josh King kind of plays in that kind of striker position mostly as a centre forward, really. But Dennis does play left wing, and he can get chances to score. And at 5.2, I mean, he is ultimately an enabler. You'll be able to kind of flexibly move, hopefully, if you draft your team correctly around Dennis. So, he shouldn't be someone who starts every week, but I think, when there are nice fixtures, it does make sense to actually have him in. And yeah, so I think Dennis makes sense in that sense. Pukki, of course, is someone who also scored, but we both knew kind of heading into that Watford-Norwich game that it could either be a low goal scoring affair because both these teams are very poor, or, I mean, it could be, both of these teams kind of finding their own level, kind of facing much weaker opposition. And I don't think you're going to get more chances with Norwich kind of building goals, really, for Pukki. And I don't think he's really worth it, given the fact that he's more pricey than Dennis. I think Norwich probably are unfortunately the worst team in the league, and it's unfortunate, but that's pretty much how I see things. With Armstrong, I think Southampton have actually been improving on defense, but in terms of attack, they really haven't built much XG in the last 2 games. Um, and I still feel like he's a clear avoid player. I think there's much more interesting assets in that kind of 6.5 range if you just stretch your budget a little bit more. And that's exactly why I've given Tony a rise. I mean, Tony kind of finally found like a talismanic performance in the sense that he scored a penalty and also was able to kind of create a fantastic chance for Mbeumo. And I think the issue with Tony is once again the fact that I think Brentford are probably more interested in kind of keeping their defensive structure intact, and he plays such a large role even on the defensive front. And I think due to that, there might be games where Brentford can be shut out, but I think their kind of aim as a team really is to keep those clean sheets as a basis, and then kind of create attacks when they're actually in control of the game. And that's not going to be the case versus most of the, I think, opposition in the league, just due to the fact that the Premier League competition is so healthy and so strong. There are going to be, of course, games where Tony can, I think, explode, and I think we saw that versus Wolves. And to be honest, with the way we rated the Wolves' defense, I think it was very impressive that Tony had such a talismanic performance, so I have to give him a rise on that basis. Mopé and Edouard still remain as differentials for me. I mean, Edouard, as I said, you have to kind of watch that space. You can't just pick a player in just because he came on as a sub. You have to kind of see whether, Vieira changes his mind with regards to, whether Benteke gets full minutes and et cetera, et cetera. So, but with St. Max, I think he was someone that I actually put into the list last week as a differential, and I'm really glad he showed the full extent of his capabilities versus a very poor Leeds defense. And I think on that basis, you can probably say St. Max is quite an explosive player. I think a lot of defenses will struggle to defend versus him. Whether he's going to score every game is a different question, but I think the fact that he has very good expected assist numbers also means that at that 6.5 price, he's quite worth it, to be honest, to kind of play around with and maybe balance the budget of your team. So I think it makes sense to have him, especially when Wilson is out. He's still clearly the key kind of forward threat. Before Wilson maybe comes back into the side. With Jimenez, I really have to just drop him into a fall. I do think in a week where Bamford was probably the best asset, in a week where DCL was still injured, Wilson was still out, and Antonio was red carded, I think it made sense to say that Jimenez was probably a best option for that week, especially if you couldn't afford Bamford. But I just think that he lacks the same kind of confidence in terms of how hungry he is for goals. And it sounds like a very arbitrary argument, and it's based on an eye test. But I do think you have to say that Jimenez was a talismanic player because he was able to kind of capitalize on these headers that he used to do when in the 18-19 season. But if you actually watch the matches or the last 2 games where he's been given fantastic crosses, I think I've seen him miss 2 clear-cut headers that he would have done in 18-19. And on that basis, I have to say he has to fall. I think he's good in terms of build-up, in terms of link-up as well. But I just have to say, as a striker at 7.5, you're looking for goals at 7.4 as well. And he just really hasn't provided that. And he hasn't kind of provided that kind of edge that I would like to see from a striker. And for that reason, I think he has to drop for me. He might even drop to a differential eventually. But, as I said, it's similar to the thing with Wolves where you have to kind of assess the underlying stats, make sure you back that up by actual gameplay. And I think even though the chances are being built for Jimenez, he just really isn't taking them. And he's finally taken a fall this week as a result, especially since Antonio comes back into the side. And for that reason, of course, Antonio has, a corresponding rise. I think Antonio has a fantastic match versus Leeds. We've seen him, I think he has the ability really to score versus most teams in the league, with the exception to those kind of top 3 defenses that I mentioned that could probably have, a good game versus him if they kind of team up correctly and play as a structured side. But I think Antonio is pretty much a phenom, and at the price he is at, he's still really worthwhile as a player. So I think, having like, let's say, the offense that I have right now with Bamford and Antonio, I'm quite happy with how things are at. I might have to maybe move away from Bamford eventually if Leeds struggle, especially when, let's say, that Rafinha might be out. But I still think these two are probably the kind of leading forwards who are not approaching that kind of high price of 8 plus or 8.5 plus really. I think Ings and DCL, once again, they just have corresponding falls. DCL hasn't fallen. He was at a void last week. Ings, I think, the only reason why I've dropped him into a fall category is because I do think that this Aston Villa side are actually creating goals through different areas of the pitch, I think. And that actually means that Ings is less of a talisman for me. I think when Watkins comes in, he adds a little bit of a dimension. I don't think it's necessarily the fact that this kind of Aston Villa side are building attacks for Ings. And I think, if he's not like a talismanic player for the team, then I think he's not that interesting of an option. On top of that, I think the fixtures are a little bit middling for Aston Villa. I wouldn't say he's a fantastic clear cut option. So on that basis, I have to say that I think he drops into an avoid category where you start to definitely look to maybe moving to Antonio or someone else, or even downgrading, for example, so that you can actually improve the kind of formation of your team and the overall kind of budget flexibility and balance of the team. Aubameyang for me, he falls. I was expecting him to have a really good game versus Burnley, and ultimately, I think the lack of chance that Arsenal created just tells me the fact that it's probably not worth it to play with that kind of fire with Aubameyang. I think if you were looking at him for like a small punt, that's totally fine, but it is also time as well. I think if you give him another week, maybe in what would be a very tough Tottenham game, to actually move away from him. I just think that probably around that price range, Vardy makes a little bit more sense. He's a much more consistent goal scorer, and I think when you look at last season as well, if you're going to look at historic performances, I would say Vardy still managed a fantastic tally, whereas Aubameyang did not. Lacazette was kind of that focal point for Arsenal last season when they were actually in good form and able to actually score consistently versus teams and explode against them. But right now, I think of Aubameyang pretty much only scoring a tap in so far. I think it's still rough for Arsenal, and I think you don't want to spend that kind of money on a player. In terms of the keepers, if we actually move to the keepers, so I think the only real change is the fact that I've added Ramsdale into the kind of list of the keepers. I'm still kind of keeping watch over Ramsdale and Guaita because I think both these players could really be moved into best options. And even McCarthy, I think, from Southampton has to be given an honourable mention before I maybe add him in next week. I think we're approaching a stage in the league where there are clearly some mid-table sides that will actually have a strong defensive structure, and I think that's due to the fact that they have good managers behind them, or a good kind of like tactical philosophy that the club has instilled. I think Brentford, for example, look very ready for the Premier League. Brighton are led by Potter. Ramsdale. I mean, whatever you think about Arteta, I do think that if there's anything he's been able to do within the last few years is at least keep clean sheets versus weaker opposition. I would say, of course, they dropped the ball in terms of attack. I think Arsenal are still very poor in terms of creating chances, but Ramsdale's an interesting defensive option for me for sure. And Guaita, I think I do really like the work of Vieira so far. They've obviously conceded 3 goals twice already versus Chelsea and Liverpool, but I don't think that's unexpected. I think these are both, for me, the 2 best sides in the league. And City is very close in amongst that kind of like list of best teams. And ultimately, I think Guaita will probably prove to actually have a very good season, and we can see that as well with the points panning out the way they have. In terms of keepers that have fallen, I think Meslier and Sa have to fall. I wasn't really into going for Sa or doubling up on Wolves. My general philosophy is that when you have a mid-table team or a bottom, table team, you don't want to double up on their defense. There are still so many options in around the league, and I think it's just better to have a more diversified defense because it pans out a little bit better week to week. If you're kind of relying on a Wolves clean sheet week to week, and you've doubled up on these players, it doesn't make sense, especially when you have Wolves assets at 4.5, as I mentioned previously, or even Semedo at 4.9. Honestly, that could get you those clean sheet points. Yes, maybe Sa can get you bonus points in games, but I feel like we haven't seen enough of Wolves to justify going for a double up of their defense, and I think for that reason, Sa doesn't make too much sense. With Meslier, I think last season you were looking at him for bonus points. And the fact that also they still managed to get 12 clean sheets last season, which was still around, I think, top 10 in terms of clean sheets. So more around the top half of the table. But given the way that the defense has panned out, given the way that they've opened the league, given the way they've played versus some very weak opposition and still kind of conceded, I just can't value Meslier as a good option. I think he's just a differential at this point. With Martinez, I've kind of risen him again. It's just due to the fact that he's kind of returned, and I think Aston Villa look very, very solid and have done, to be honest, for the last 2 games. I know they were blitzed by Chelsea 3 goals, but I really have to say, when you look at that Chelsea-Aston Villa game, you look back at it, those were just world-class goals scored by some very informed players. I don't think that's, a way to look at, Aston Villa being a terrible side. I think if you were looking at the Watford game, you'd probably make that judgment. But since then, I think Aston Villa have been relatively solid, and I think Martinez makes sense. But as we all know with FPL, it doesn't really make too much sense to invest too much into keepers unless there's a clear outlier who is performing at a fantastic level, and that's pretty much how I see things right now. But thank you guys so much for watching this week. A little bit more of a longer cheat sheet video, but just wanted to kind of break it down for you guys and let you guys know how I feel about all the teams and all the players so far. In terms of, who's an injury concern, who's a rotation concern, you can kind of see that by the asterisks. Nothing too, crazy, I think, this week. I think most teams are fine. Last week was the kind of rough one where, you had Antonio out, you have to kind of maybe make a decision on DCL and things like that. But this week is seemingly quite a quiet week, I would say. But I think, we have gotten to see, once again, a little bit more from Brentford on an attacking front. And some weaknesses from Wolves, to be honest. And in terms of the other teams in the league, some kind of slight changes with, let's say, Arsenal's defense with Ramsdale coming in and things like that. But thank you guys so much for watching the video. I hope to see you guys soon, and I'll catch you guys for the team selection video and an upcoming podcast video that I'll be uploading very shortly.